At 11:47 p.m. on a quiet stretch of Highway 87 outside Kalispell, Montana, a state trooper flips on his lights behind a dusty gray sedan with a busted taillight. It is October of 2024. The stop should take 5 minutes. Instead, it will end up reopening a case that has haunted an entire county for 18 years. But to understand why a broken taillight would matter to anyone beyond the man writing the ticket, we have to go back. We have to go back to a warm Saturday in August of 2006, to the shore of Whitcomb Lake, and to a 4-year-old boy in a red life jacket named Ethan Walker. The Whitcomb Lake Summer Festival was the kind of event nobody in Larkspur County missed. Food stands lined the gravel lot behind the boat launch. A local band played on a flatbed trailer. Children ran between blankets spread across the grass while parents traded gossip and lemonade. Daniel Walker, the county sheriff, had worked the festival every year of his 10-year tenure, usually in uniform, always with one eye on the crowd out of habit. That year, for the first time, he brought his own son along to enjoy it rather than patrol it. His wife, Carol, had packed a cooler. Ethan had been talking about the funnel cake stand for a week. By all accounts, the afternoon unfolded exactly as it always did. Witnesses remember Ethan playing near the water's edge with 2 older children from a neighboring ranch, building a small fort out of driftwood while their parents sat nearby, talking freely among themselves. Carol remembers glancing over every few minutes, the way any mother does at a lake full of strangers, counting the red life jacket among the crowd, almost without thinking about it. Daniel remembers stepping away for perhaps 10 minutes to speak with a deputy about a minor disturbance near the parking area, a scuffle between 2 teenagers that turned out to be nothing at all, a decision he would revisit in his mind for the rest of his life, turning it over the way a person turns over a stone, looking for something that was never there. The band on the flatbed trailer had just finished a set when Carol first called Ethan's name. She has said in later interviews that she wasn't alarmed at first, not really. Children wander at festivals. They find a friend, they follow a dog, they get distracted by a magician or a face-painting booth 2 tents over. She walked the shoreline calling his name in the easy, unhurried tone of a parent who expects an answer within the minute. It was only when that minute became 5, and 5 became 10 with no small voice calling back, that her voice changed, and the people around her noticed. When Carol called Ethan's name and got no answer, she assumed he had wandered toward the food stands. 5 minutes became 10, 10 became panic. By the time Daniel reached her, volunteers were already fanning out along the shoreline, and the sheriff of Larkspur County was, for the first time in his career, the father of a missing child. Before we go further into what happened that day and in the years that followed, I want to take a moment to thank those of you who have been with this channel since the beginning, reconstructing these cases with us one archive at a time. If you're new here, welcome. Archive 26 exists to piece together real human stories from the records, testimonies, and investigative findings left behind. If that kind of storytelling speaks to you, consider subscribing, because there are many more cases like this one still waiting to be told. The first hours of any child disappearance are considered the most critical, and Daniel Walker knew that better than almost anyone in the state. He called in every off-duty deputy. He requested state police backup before some parents had even realized a search was underway. Boats went out on the lake within the hour. A perimeter was established around the festival grounds, and every vehicle leaving the area was logged, though in the chaos of a crowded event, dozens had already come and gone unrecorded. Search dogs arrived from 2 counties over by early evening. They picked up Ethan's scent near the water's edge, then lost it near the tree line bordering the eastern side of the festival grounds, a detail that would become central to theories about the case for years afterward. Did the boy wander into the woods and become disoriented? Did he fall into the lake, a possibility divers would spend the following weeks trying to rule in or out? Or did something else happen entirely, something that no search dog could track because it involved a vehicle rather than a set of small footprints? By midnight, there was still no sign of him. Carol sat wrapped in a blanket near the command tent, refusing to leave the lakeshore, even as temperatures dropped and volunteers gently suggested she rest. Daniel, still in uniform, coordinated search grids with a steadiness that later struck several deputies as almost unnatural, the discipline of a lawman holding himself together because he understood, better than anyone, that panic would not bring his son home. One deputy recalled that Daniel personally walked the eastern tree line twice himself that night, long after the organized search teams had rotated out to rest. A local news van arrived just after 1 a.m., drawn by a police scanner report of a missing child connected to the sheriff himself. By sunrise, the story had spread beyond Larkspur County. Daniel declined every interview request that first night, focused entirely on the search grid spread across a folding table inside the command tent, where hand-drawn sections of shoreline and forest were being crossed off one by one as teams reported back with nothing to show for their hours of walking. What none of them knew that night was that this would not be a case measured in hours or even days. It would stretch into weeks, then years, then decades, a wound that would define a family, a department, and eventually an entire community's understanding of what it means to lose a child without ever knowing why. We'll pick up the search itself and the strange absence of evidence that followed it in the chapter ahead. A note before we continue. This story is a fictional narrative inspired by the real emotional weight of missing persons cases across the country. Any resemblance to a specific individual or investigation is unintentional. It is presented for entertainment and reflection. By dawn on Sunday, what had begun as a handful of worried festival-goers searching the shoreline had become one of the largest search operations Larkspur County had ever organized. Sheriff Daniel Walker, despite being asked repeatedly by his own department to step back given his personal involvement, refused to leave the command post. He would later admit in a recorded interview years afterward that stepping away felt like admitting his son was already gone. More than 300 volunteers arrived over the following 72 hours. Some were neighbors. Some drove in from towns 2 hours away after hearing the news on local radio. Search and rescue teams from 3 neighboring counties coordinated grid searches through the dense pine forest bordering Whitcomb Lake, working in staggered lines from dawn until well past dark, their flashlights visible from the ridge above the water like a slow-moving constellation. Divers entered the lake on the second day. Whitcomb Lake is not especially deep near the shoreline, but it drops sharply roughly 40 yards out, and visibility below 10 feet is close to nothing even in daylight. Teams worked in shifts using sonar equipment borrowed from the State Fisheries Department, mapping the lakebed section by section, marking each cleared quadrant on a laminated chart pinned inside the command tent. They found fishing tackle, a rusted outboard motor lost decades earlier, and the frame of a bicycle, but nothing belonging to a 4-year-old boy. The dive team's supervisor, in a report filed at the end of the first week, noted something that would later be revisited many times. The search had been unusually thorough by any professional standard, covering not only the immediate shoreline, but nearly the entire accessible perimeter of the lake, including sections rarely searched in typical drowning investigations because they were considered too far from where a small child could plausibly have wandered unassisted. Nothing about the geography, in other words, supported the theory that Ethan had simply walked into the water on his own. Helicopters from the state police swept the surrounding terrain, focusing on ravines and old logging roads where a disoriented child might have wandered. K9 units worked the tree line where Ethan's scent had gone cold the first night, running the search repeatedly over 4 days in the hope that shifting wind conditions might pick the trail back up. It never did. What struck investigators most, even in those early days, was not what they found but what they didn't. There were no torn clothes snagged on branches, no small footprints leading away from the water in any consistent direction, no abandoned shoe, no dropped toy, nothing that typically surfaces even in tragic drowning cases once a body is recovered days or weeks later. The lake, when finally cleared by dive teams after 2 full weeks, produced no remains. I want to pause here and ask you something many investigators asked themselves at the time. When a search this extensive turns up absolutely nothing, no evidence of an accident, no evidence of foul play, nothing at all, does that absence tell its own story? It's a question worth sitting with as we move forward, because it shaped every decision made in the years that followed. State investigators formally joined the case by the end of the first week, working alongside Larkspur County detectives to interview every festival attendee who could be identified. Over 400 people were eventually spoken to, cross-referenced against parking records, vendor logs, and the handful of photographs and home videos festival goers voluntarily submitted. A few blurry frames showed Ethan near the water around the time he was last seen. None showed what happened afterward. Tips began arriving almost immediately: a family camping nearby who left in a hurry, a truck seen idling near the tree line, a stranger asking a vendor for directions to the interstate. Each lead was run down. Each one eventually led nowhere. The truck belonged to a fisherman with a documented alibi, confirmed by receipts from a bait shop 40 minutes away, and a neighbor who placed him at home before the festival even began. The camping family was located and cleared within days, their movements accounted for by a string of gas station and grocery receipts along their route out of state. The stranger turned out to be a lost tourist who had simply asked for directions and continued on his way, confirmed by a gas station receipt 2 towns over, and later by a credit card statement, placing him 300 miles away by that evening. Investigators also pursued a theory involving registered sex offenders living within a 50-mile radius of the lake, a standard procedure in child disappearance cases, regardless of how unlikely any individual lead might initially seem. Each of the 11 individuals identified was interviewed, and each provided an alibi that was independently verified within the first 10 days. None were ever connected to the case in any way, though the process of ruling them out consumed a significant portion of the department's early investigative resources. By the end of the 3rd week, the active search wound down, not because anyone had given up, but because there was, quite simply, nowhere left to search. Larkspur County had covered every inch of shoreline, forest, and roadway within a 20-mile radius. Divers had mapped the entire lake floor twice, and Ethan Walker was still gone. Carol Walker would later describe those weeks as living inside a held breath, unable to grieve because there was nothing to grieve, unable to hope because hope had nothing left to stand on. Daniel returned to his duties as sheriff within a month, in part because the department needed him, and in part, those close to him said because the alternative was sitting still with his thoughts. What none of them could have known was that the true explanation for Ethan's disappearance would not come from the lake, the forest, or the highway at all. It would come nearly 2 decades later, from a records database flagged during a routine traffic stop hundreds of miles away, a thread so thin that for 18 years no one thought to pull it. Grief for the Walker family did not arrive all at once. It arrived in waves, spaced out over years, each one triggered by something ordinary. A birthday that should have been celebrated, a school bus passing the house each September, a stranger's laugh in a grocery store that sounded, for one impossible second, like it could belong to a boy who would now be 5, then 8, then 12. The tips never fully stopped. In the 2 years following Ethan's disappearance, the department logged over 140 reported sightings across 11 states. A woman in Spokane was certain she'd seen him at a laundromat, standing beside a man she described as nervous and unwilling to make eye contact. A trucker in Idaho reported a child matching his description at a rest stop off I-90, a tip serious enough that state police intercepted the family in question at the next way station, only to confirm through a birth certificate on hand that the boy was in fact their own son. A tip from as far away as Texas described a boy who just looked like the photo, submitted by a well-meaning stranger who had seen the case on a national news segment. Each one was investigated. Each one required contacting local law enforcement, sometimes flying out an investigator, occasionally requesting DNA samples from families who bore no relation to the case at all. Every single lead was eliminated, and every elimination arrived at the Walker household as its own small private grief. A door that had briefly opened, only to close again. Carol Walker has described this period as the cruelest phase of the entire ordeal, harder in some ways than the initial disappearance itself, because each new tip demanded that she allow herself to hope again, fully knowing from painful experience how it would likely end. "You learn to hold the hope at arm's length," she said in a 2014 interview, "close enough to survive on, far enough that it doesn't destroy you when it doesn't pan out." By 2010, 4 years after the disappearance, the department had exhausted what Daniel privately called the ordinary avenues. Age-progressed images of Ethan were released to national databases, and distributed through the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Billboards along interstate corridors in 3 states carried his photograph for over a year. A cold case unit within the state police was formally assigned to review the file, cross-checking it against unsolved abduction cases nationwide, searching for any pattern that might connect Whitcomb Lake to a broader scheme. None emerged. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that settles into a family after a decade without answers. Not the sharp pain of the first weeks, but something quieter and more permanent. Carol Walker became involved with a regional support network for families of missing children, a role she has said gave her purpose, even as it required reliving her son's disappearance in conversation after conversation with grieving strangers. Daniel remained sheriff until 2019, when he retired after 13 years in the role, telling a local reporter at the time that he intended to spend his remaining years doing anything other than looking at case files. Those close to him say he never stopped looking. By 2015, the file had technically been reclassified as a cold case, not closed, never closed, but no longer under active daily investigation. It remained, however, one of the most referenced unsolved disappearances in Montana law enforcement history, taught in some regional training programs as a case study in search coordination and the limits of physical evidence. What do you do with a case that has no ending? I think that question sat with investigators long after the file was reclassified. There was no confirmation of death to grieve, and no confirmation of life to hope toward. Just an open file, updated occasionally with a cleared tip, sitting in a cabinet that Daniel Walker, even after retirement, would visit more often than his former colleagues ever mentioned publicly. By the case's 10th anniversary in 2016, local media ran a retrospective segment revisiting the disappearance, interviewing surviving witnesses and volunteers who still remembered the festival that day with unsettling clarity. Several search volunteers, now with children and grandchildren of their own, described still scanning crowds at public events out of habit, an instinct they said they doubted would ever fully leave them. One volunteer, who had walked the Eastern Tree Line search grid as a young father in 2006, told the reporter that he still could not attend the Whitcomb Lake Festival, held annually every August since, without feeling a specific physical unease settle into his chest the moment he parked his truck. The Whitcomb Lake Summer Festival itself continued each year, though attendance dipped noticeably in the seasons, immediately following Ethan's disappearance before slowly recovering. Some families in the county have said they never quite let their own children out of sight at that lake again, regardless of how many years passed, a quiet, lasting ripple from a single afternoon that most of them had no direct connection to at all. Nothing about the following years suggested the case would ever move again. DNA databases were checked periodically against unidentified remains recovered across the country, a grim but standard procedure for long-term missing children cases. None matched. Investigators also submitted Ethan's profile to a handful of emerging genetic genealogy databases as the technology became more widely available in the early 2020s, another avenue that, for years, produced nothing. The trail, as far as anyone could tell, had gone permanently cold, not because investigators stopped caring, but because there was, quite literally, nothing left to investigate. That would remain true for 18 years. Until a trooper on a dark stretch of highway noticed a taillight, glowing red instead of white, and pulled a car over for what should have been the most routine stop of his shift. Trooper Aaron Kessler had worked Highway 87 for 6 years by the time he pulled the gray sedan over that October night in 2024. He would later describe the stop in his official report as unremarkable right up until the moment it wasn't. The driver, a man who identified himself as Thomas Reyes, 22 years old, was calm, cooperative, and produced a valid Montana driver's license without hesitation. There was no odor of alcohol, no erratic behavior, no reason for Kessler to suspect anything beyond a burnt-out bulb. Kessler ran the license through the state system as a matter of standard procedure. It came back clean, no warrants, no prior offenses, a spotless record dating back to when Reyes had first obtained a learner's permit at 16. He noted in his report that Reyes worked as a diesel mechanic at a shop roughly 20 miles from where the stop occurred, had lived at the same address for the past 3 years, and answered every question calmly, occasionally glancing at the dashboard clock in the mild, unremarkable way of someone eager to get home rather than someone with anything to hide. Kessler was preparing to issue a simple equipment violation notice when a secondary flag appeared on his terminal, one he had seen perhaps twice in his entire career. A records discrepancy generated by the state's newly updated identity verification software, cross-referencing vital records with issued documentation. The software itself had only been implemented statewide a few months earlier, part of a broader initiative to catch delayed and fraudulent birth registrations that had until then largely gone unnoticed within routine license checks. Kessler would later note, somewhat wryly, that had the stop occurred even a year earlier, the flag likely would never have appeared at all, and the case might have remained closed forever. The flag indicated that the birth registration number associated with Reyes's identification had been issued years after his declared date of birth. In practical terms, this meant the paper trail establishing Thomas Reyes's identity did not begin as it should have, in a hospital record shortly after birth. It began years later, through a delayed registration process typically reserved for individuals born outside formal medical settings or, in rare cases, flagged for administrative fraud review. Kessler, to his credit, did not treat the moment as an accusation. He explained the discrepancy to Reyes plainly, noting that this was likely a clerical issue that would need to be resolved through the State Records Office. Reyes, according to Kessler's report, appeared genuinely confused rather than alarmed, stating that as far as he knew, his documents had always been in order and that he had never had reason to question them. The stop ended with a warning for the tail light and a referral slip directing Reyes to the Department of Vital Records to sort out what both men, at that point, assumed was nothing more than an outdated filing error. Kessler would later say that he nearly didn't mention the flag at all, considering how minor it seemed, compared to the equipment violation, and that he only brought it up because department policy required any records discrepancy to be formally disclosed to the individual involved. Neither man had any reason yet to suspect this was anything more than paperwork. What happened over the following days, however, is what turned an administrative footnote into a formal investigation. When the flag discrepancy was routed as required to a specialized documentation fraud unit within the State Records Office, an analyst named Priya Chandran pulled the full file rather than issuing a routine correction. Something about the pattern of late registration paired with an otherwise flawless subsequent record, school enrollment, driver's licensing, employment history, struck her as inconsistent with the typical explanations she encountered in her role. Chandran's initial review, completed within a week, is what escalated the matter beyond a records correction. She noted that Reyes's earliest verifiable school enrollment record began at age 9, in a rural school district roughly 400 miles from where Whitcomb Lake sits, with no prior educational records of any kind on file. No kindergarten, no early elementary attendance anywhere in the state or any state she could cross-reference. There was no infant or early childhood medical history attached to his name in any regional health system. His Social Security number, when traced, had been issued at age 9 as well, alongside the delayed birth registration, both processed within the same month. None of this proved anything criminal on its own. Late registrations happen. Families who homeschool, who move frequently, or who simply fall behind on paperwork can produce records that look unusual on paper without anything sinister behind them. Chandran, who had processed hundreds of similar delayed registration cases over her 7 years in the role, later said that what set this file apart was not any single document, but the total absence of anything preceding it. No hospital discharge paperwork referenced anywhere, no pediatrician's office ever listed on an insurance claim, no immunization record transferred from a previous provider, which is unusual even among families who move often or homeschool their children. Chandran's report, submitted to her supervisor, was careful and measured, recommending only that the case be reviewed further before any correction was formally processed. She flagged, specifically, the complete lack of any documentation trail prior to age 9 as the detail warranting closer attention, rather than the late registration itself, which by that point she had seen dozens of times for entirely innocent reasons. It was a modest, procedural recommendation, the kind filed and forgotten dozens of times a year in offices like Chandran's across the state. It would end up reopening the most well-known unsolved disappearance in the county's history, though it would take several more weeks and a great deal more quiet paperwork before anyone connected the two. The document fraud review that began with Priya Chandran's report was at first entirely disconnected from the Walker case. Nobody in the records office in 2024 was thinking about a lake festival from 2006. The investigation existed purely to determine whether Thomas Reyes's identity documents had been fraudulently obtained, a question with a range of mundane and serious possible explanations, anything from a paperwork backlog decades old to deliberate identity fabrication. What broadened the inquiry was a second analyst brought in to assist Chandran, who noticed something in the address history attached to Reyes's earliest records. The family listed as his guardians at the time of his delayed registration, a couple named Marcus and Diane Colton, had moved 3 times in the 2 years before that registration was filed, each move taking them farther from their previous address and notably farther from Larkspur County, where records showed the Coltons had briefly resided in the summer of 2006. This was not, on its own, damning. Families move. But it was enough for the fraud unit to expand the scope of interviews, reaching out to individuals who had known the Colton family during the relevant years. Several of those interviews produced accounts that, when compiled together, painted a picture no one in the records office had expected to encounter. A retired teacher from the rural school district, where young Thomas Reyes, then known by a different name, had first enrolled at age 9, recalled the family's arrival distinctly. They came in partway through the year, which wasn't unusual out here, she told investigators. But what stuck with me was how little they'd talk about where they'd come from. Most families who move, you ask a simple question and they tell you a story. This family gave you one sentence and changed the subject. She recalled the boy as quiet, well-behaved, and noticeably behind academically for his age, something the school attributed at the time to prior homeschooling that was never formally documented. A former neighbor of the Colton family, interviewed separately, described Diane Colton as a woman who doted on that boy like she'd waited her whole life for him, while noting that Marcus Colton rarely spoke about his own background and discouraged questions about the family's life before settling in the community. The same neighbor recalled an incident, small at the time but striking in hindsight, in which a visiting relative had once referred to the boy by a name the neighbor didn't recognize before quickly correcting herself. A slip the neighbor had assumed was simply a nickname mix-up and had never thought about again until investigators came asking questions nearly 2 decades later. A third interview with a former co-worker of Marcus Colton's from a job he held briefly in 2009 added another thread. The co-worker recalled Marcus mentioning, only once and never again, that the family had started over after some kind of trouble back east, a comment he had never elaborated on, and that his co-worker had never pressed him about, assuming it was none of his business. Neither detail was unusual enough alone to raise alarm at the time. Together, compiled across more than a dozen interviews spanning 3 states, they formed a pattern investigators could no longer dismiss as coincidence. What do you make of a pattern like that, where no single detail is suspicious, but the accumulation of small omissions starts to feel deliberate? That was the question facing investigators as the file grew heavier with each new interview, each one adding a thread that, alone, meant very little, but together suggested a family that had gone to considerable lengths to avoid being looked at too closely. The fraud unit, now working in coordination with a state investigator familiar with long-term missing persons protocols, requested archived signature samples from the Coltons' early paperwork, rental agreements, employment applications, the delayed birth registration itself, and compared them against samples collected years earlier during unrelated administrative processes. Several signatures attributed to Diane Colton showed inconsistencies significant enough that a forensic document examiner recommended further analysis, though the examiner was careful to note that signature variation alone could not establish fraud with certainty, since handwriting naturally shifts over years and under stress. What the examiner did note, however, was a more unusual finding. The notarized delayed birth registration itself had been processed at a small, since-closed notary office in a different state entirely, one with no other connection to the family's documented residence history at the time. Locating any surviving records from that office proved difficult, and the notary who had signed off on the registration had passed away in 2018, leaving investigators unable to question the one person who might have remembered the circumstances of that specific filing. A dead end that, frustratingly, closed off what might have been the fastest route to an answer. It was at this point, roughly 6 weeks into what had begun as a routine taillight stop, that someone on the investigative team, accounts differ on exactly who first raised it, pulled the geographic and chronological details together and asked the question that would change the direction of the entire case. Could this be connected to the Walker disappearance from 2006? A junior analyst reportedly pulled up the old case file almost on a whim, expecting to find nothing, and instead found a timeline that lined up with unsettling precision. The theory, once spoken aloud, was almost too large to immediately act on. It would require far more than a hunch and a handful of contradictory interviews. It would require independent, verifiable evidence connecting a specific timeline of events before anyone could justify the next step, the kind of step that could not be undone once taken. Investigators requested an official photograph comparison before pursuing the theory any further, aware that raising it prematurely with the Walker family could cause irreparable harm if the connection proved false. A forensic facial analysis unit compared a childhood photograph of Ethan Walker, taken roughly 2 months before his disappearance, against the earliest available photograph of the boy enrolled at age 9 under the name given by the Colton family. The analysis, using bone structure mapping and growth pattern modeling rather than simple visual comparison, concluded that the similarities were sufficient to warrant further biological investigation, a careful clinical phrase that nonetheless sent a current through everyone working the case. The examiner specifically noted consistency in ear structure and orbital spacing, features considered more reliable across age progression than general facial appearance, which can shift considerably between early childhood and adulthood. It was not proof. It was permission to keep looking. The lead investigator on the case, a state detective named Robert Ashby, who had spent much of his early career working missing persons cases, later admitted that he deliberately avoided informing the Walker family at this stage, despite significant internal pressure from a junior colleague who felt they deserved to know as soon as any credible lead emerged. Ashby's reasoning, which he defended repeatedly throughout the investigation, was that 18 years of false hope had taught him the weight of getting a family's expectations wrong, and he was not willing to do that a second time to people who had already suffered through it once. The county prosecutor's office, when consulted, was unambiguous about what would happen next. Before any DNA testing could be authorized, testing that would require either a court order or the voluntary participation of a 22-year-old man who had no idea his entire identity was under investigation, prosecutors wanted independent corroborating evidence. A facial analysis and a pattern of suspicious paperwork, however compelling, were not enough to justify the emotional and legal weight of what came next. This is, in many ways, the least dramatic part of the investigation, and also the most essential. Investigators spent the following weeks doing the quiet, unglamorous work that rarely appears in dramatized accounts of criminal cases. Pulling old medical clinic receipts from a rural health center the Coltons had visited under an assumed billing arrangement in early 2007, cross-referencing rental agreements that placed the family in a town roughly 6 hours from Whitcomb Lake within 4 months of Ethan's disappearance, and locating a former landlord who recalled Diane Colton arriving with a young child already in tow, despite no prior record of pregnancy or childbirth associated with her name anywhere in the state. Each piece, gathered individually, built toward a chronology that investigators could defend in court. A woman with no documented pregnancy, appearing in a new town with a toddler within months of a highly publicized child disappearance 400 miles away, followed by a pattern of relocation, delayed school enrollment, and a birth registration filed years after the fact under circumstances that avoided the kind of hospital or medical documentation that would typically accompany a legitimate late registration. Ashby's team also pulled archived local newspaper coverage of the Whitcomb Lake disappearance from the fall of 2006 and cross-referenced it against the exact timing of the Coltons' first documented relocation, finding that the family had left their prior residence within 11 days of the story reaching regional television coverage, a detail that, while circumstantial, fit uncomfortably well within the chronology investigators were assembling. On its own, it proved nothing. Layered atop everything else, alongside the school records, the medical gaps, and the facial analysis, it was difficult for anyone on the team to keep reading as coincidence. Would you have moved forward at this point, knowing what was at stake for the family on the other end of that DNA test? It's worth considering, because for investigators, this was the hardest part of the entire process. Not the paperwork, but the responsibility of deciding when enough was enough, and when withholding that decision any longer would only prolong a family's uncertainty rather than protect them from it. Ashby has said he revisited that question nearly every night during those final weeks of preparation, aware that a single misstep could either hand the Walkers the answer they had waited 18 years for, or shatter them further with a false one, a risk he refused to take lightly. By late November, the case file had grown thick enough that the prosecutor's office agreed to authorize a court order for DNA comparison, pending voluntary cooperation from Thomas Reyes, who by then had been contacted directly by investigators and informed gently and carefully that his identity documents were under review in connection with a decades-old missing persons case. According to the lead investigator's later account, Reyes sat in stunned silence for nearly a full minute before agreeing to provide a sample, saying only that he needed to know one way or the other. Daniel and Carol Walker were not informed of the developing theory until investigators had exhausted every avenue of independent verification available to them, a decision made deliberately to avoid raising false hope after 18 years of exactly that. When they were finally briefed in a quiet conference room at the Larkspur County Sheriff's Office in early December, Daniel reportedly asked only one question before agreeing to provide his own comparison sample. "How sure are you?" The honest answer, at that point, was that no one could be entirely sure. Not yet. The DNA results came back on a Tuesday morning in mid-December, 18 years and 4 months after Ethan Walker vanished from the shore of Whitcomb Lake. The comparison confirmed what the paperwork, the photographs, and 18 weeks of quiet investigative work had built toward. Thomas Reyes was biologically Ethan Daniel Walker. The full account, pieced together over the following months through interviews, financial records, and eventually a formal confession, described a story far more painful and far less calculated than a stranger abduction theory might have suggested. Diane Colton, it emerged, had been a close family friend of the Walkers in the summer of 2006, present at the festival that day, and had been struggling for years with an undiagnosed and increasingly severe psychological condition compounded by the recent loss of a pregnancy of her own, a loss she had told almost no one about. According to her later statements to investigators, she had approached Ethan near the water that afternoon, intending, in her words, only to comfort him after he'd scraped his knee, and had walked him toward the parking area to find a bandage. What happened next, she claimed, was not a plan, but a break. A sudden, overwhelming decision made in a state of crisis that she herself struggled to fully explain even years later. She placed him in her car and drove. Marcus Colton, her partner at the time, has maintained that he did not learn the truth of the child's origin until days after Diane arrived at a motel 3 states away with a boy he was told was hers from a prior relationship. He has told investigators that by the time he recognized the boy from national news coverage of the disappearance, he felt trapped by a decision that was no longer entirely his to unmake, a claim prosecutors have treated with open skepticism, given his active role in arranging the family's subsequent relocations and the falsified paperwork that followed. Whether or not that account holds up fully under continued legal scrutiny remains part of the ongoing prosecution, but investigators have found no evidence contradicting the timeline of his gradual, rather than immediate, awareness. Diane Colton's formal statement to investigators, delivered through her attorney, described the days following Ethan's disappearance as a blur. She has struggled for years to fully reconstruct, even in her own memory, a claim consistent according to a court-appointed psychological evaluation, with a dissociative response to acute psychological distress. She has expressed what investigators described as genuine remorse during her interviews, though remorse, as Detective Ashby noted afterward, does not undo 18 years of a family living without answers. For the next 18 years, the couple relocated repeatedly, constructed a delayed identity for the boy through a patchwork of falsified documentation, and raised him under circumstances that, whatever their origin, appear to have been loving in the ordinary day-to-day sense, a detail that has complicated public reaction to the case in ways few anticipated. Ethan, now Thomas, grew up believing entirely that Diane and Marcus were his biological parents. He has stated publicly that he had no memory whatsoever of his early years, no conscious awareness that anything about his identity had ever been altered. Diane and Marcus Colton were arrested in early 2025 and now face charges including kidnapping, document fraud, and falsification of public records, among other related counts, in a case that remains active as of this telling. Diane Colton's attorneys have indicated they intend to raise her documented mental health history as part of her defense, a legal question that will likely take considerable time to resolve. For Ethan, the aftermath has been, by every account, its own kind of disorientation, not a joyful reunion so much as the slow, disorienting process of rebuilding an identity from the ground up. He has spoken, in the limited public statements he's made, of grieving a childhood that both did and did not belong to him, of loving people who took something irreplaceable from him, and of trying to understand a father he has no memory of ever knowing. He has described the strangeness of learning that photographs he had never seen of himself as a toddler existed all along, kept for 18 years in a box in his father's house, waiting for a child who eventually came home as a stranger. He and Daniel have met several times since the DNA confirmation, meetings both men have described, separately, as tentative and painfully slow, built not on shared memory, but on the patient, deliberate work of two people trying to become family to one another for the first time. Neither has offered a timeline for what that relationship might eventually look like, and both have said, in their own way, that they've stopped expecting it to happen quickly. For Daniel Walker, now retired and reportedly in poor health, the resolution of the case brought something he had stopped allowing himself to expect. An answer. Not the return of the 4-year-old boy he lost at Whitcomb Lake. That child, in every meaningful sense, was gone the moment Diane Colton drove away 18 years ago, but confirmation, finally, of what happened, and the chance, however complicated, to know his son as the man he has become. There is no clean ending to a story like this one. There is no version of these 18 years that anyone would call justice fully served, and no DNA result that returns a stolen childhood. What there is instead is the quiet, imperfect relief of finally knowing, something this family went nearly 2 decades without. We want to sincerely thank you for spending this time with us, reconstructing this case. If this story moved you, we'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments. What part of this investigation stayed with you the longest? If you appreciate the kind of careful documentary-style storytelling we do here at Archive 26, we'd be grateful if you considered liking this video and subscribing for the cases still ahead. This story is a fictional narrative inspired by the real emotional realities of long-term missing persons cases across the country. Any resemblance to specific individuals, departments, or investigations is coincidental. It was created for entertainment and reflection.